And great. Okay. So again, chapter 19, and we're going to begin with verse 1. If you have Eitz Chaim, we're on page 880. If you have Hertz, then chapter or anything else, chapter 19. So we get here God speaking to Moses and Aaron. We've been reading something of the role of the priests, the tithes that they receive, and so on. And now we're going to move on to looking at a very specific priestly role, which is a ritual that is performed by the high priest. For those of you who just tuned in, we're looking at chapter 19 of Numbers. It's the beginning of a new Parshat Hukat, and it's on page 880 in the Eitz Chaim. So the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, Zot Hukat HaTorah. This is, the translation here is ritual law. Chok, here, Hukat HaTorah, is the chok of the Torah, or a Torah chok, translated here as ritual law. And we sometimes make a distinction, at least in English, between ritual law and other sorts of law. So, for example, and we'll come back to this law in a minute, we don't think of honoring your parents as a ritual, right? Whereas here, we're going to talk about a very specific ritual. That is the law of the red heifer, brown cow, unclear how you translate it. And I'll say more about that in a second. So the word chok, which is translated here as ritual, is an interesting word. We get, the Torah uses at least 3 different words to talk about law. One is mitzvot, right, commandments. One is mishpatim, which is statutes. And then there's chukim, which is this word. Yes, thank you, Sandy. I'll do that right now. Sandy reminds me I'm not using the speaker view. So now, as I've reminded you the last 2 weeks, now that I'm using speaker view, if you have a question, I can't see you raise your hand necessarily. So I will be pausing for questions as we go. So this is a chok. It's not a statute. It's not an ordinance. It's not a mitzvah. It's something else. So the rabbis spend some time trying to understand what a chok is and what they say. And this particular passage seems to exemplify it. It's a law for which there is no obvious reason. Right? Just something that we're supposed to do, or the Israelites, the ancient Israelites, were supposed to do. There are laws where the reason is sort of self-evident, at least clear to us, right? Love the Lord your God, honor your parents, and even eat matzah. Right? We have a reason, so we could remember the Exodus from Egypt. But here, this law, which has a purpose, which is purification, really, there's no reason. And in fact, not only is there no reason, but as we'll see in the end, it's very illogical. It's paradoxical. This is a procedure that is used to purify someone, but the purification actually turns the person who does the ritual, not the one who receives it, but the one who performs it, makes them impure. So what have you gained in some sense? A different kind of impurity, but still. It's the Midrash tells us that Solomon, who was the wisest of all people, understood all laws except this one. Didn't make any sense. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, there's a famous scene where Yochanan ben Zakkai, who is not only a leader of the Jewish community, but is the one who there are stories about him and the Romans, that he meets with them, he talks to them. Anyway, so the Midrash tells the story in which a Roman official comes to Yochanan ben Zakkai and he says, "What is this thing you do?" He says, "It makes no sense." And Yochanan ben Zakkai says to the Roman, "Well, you do magic, right? You have magic. This is magic." So the Roman leaves, and his students say to him, "Okay, great, an answer for the Romans. But now tell us, what is the real reason?" And Yochanan ben Zakkai says, "I don't know. It's commanded, so we do it." So here you have like everybody kind of throwing up their hands. Right? Maimonides believes that there is a reason for every single commandment. There must be a reason for this. He tries, but it doesn't really succeed in explaining why this ritual is done the way it does. It's done, and so on. So we're left with this very mysterious kind of procedure. A paradoxical sort of procedure. And we'll look at it now. So God tells Moses and Aaron, this is the chok. Oh, one more thing about a chok.
Writing it on there.
One more thing about a chok. So there are those who argue that one of the reasons for a chok is really because we shouldn't have a reason for a chok. Which is to say that there is a purpose in having laws that make no sense. Why? Because by doing them, we are showing that we are serving God with no alternative, what's the word? No. Hi, Carol, could you please mute yourself? Appreciate it.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. There is no reason other than it's commanded. We don't have an ulterior motive, right? We're doing it explicitly for God. Right? There was an Israeli philosopher by the name of Yeshaya Leibowitz who said, every commandment should be treated like that. Okay? We do it for God. It doesn't matter what the rationale is. It's an act of service. It's a way we show God that God is our king. What the king commands, we carry out. Okay, so we have this idea that what we have here is a chok, and what is that chok? So, tell the people of Israel to take and bring a para aduma. So a para is a cow. Par is a cow. It's often translated as a heifer, that is a young cow. But the text itself simply says it's a cow. What is important about this cow is that it is Edom. It is red, right? Something that's unusual. Now, there are some biblical scholars who say it's not really red, it's brown. So why do they say that? Because apparently there is no word for brown in biblical Hebrew. So they want to see that brown is a broader word and red is perhaps a hue of brown in the biblical, right? Language divides things in different ways. This is like the story that I have no idea if this is true, but Eskimos have, I don't know, 15 or 20 different words for snow, right? It's something they particularly attend to. We see flaky snow, wet snow. I don't know, we have a few words to describe it. When I was a kid, we used to talk about good packing snow, right? Because you could make snowballs out of it or pack it together to make a snowman. But they discriminate between all different kinds of snow, and they have lots of different words. So one scholarly suggestion here is that the word Edom doesn't exactly mean red, it means brown. Hard to say. Either way, they see, and there are three characteristics of this cow. The first is that it is red. The second is that it is without blemish. It's perfect, right? It has no extra markings on it. It is healthy. It is whole. There isn't a spot on it that isn't red, and it has never been used for any purpose other than this ritual. It's never been yoked. So that's what the people are told to look for. It is, therefore, extremely rare. Now, as we're going to see, the purpose of this is to purify people. They're going to create a potion with the ashes of this cow, and they're going to use it to purify people who have had contact with a dead body. And because contact with the dead, and I'll talk about this more in a minute, contact with the dead is, from the biblical point of view, the ultimate source of impurity. Right? And if you want to go into the tabernacle or later into the temple, you can't be impure. So you have to go through this ritual, this purification ritual, using the ashes of this cow. And if you do that, then you'll be able to go into the temple. Of course, we don't have a temple anymore, so we don't worry about this. Although if you're a Kohen, since you can't be sprinkled with these ashes because it no longer exists, there's a tradition not to go near a dead body, that is, not to go to the cemetery, because the Kohanim, right, the priests, were the ones who actually officiated in the tabernacle and later on in the temple. So two things about this. One is that I sort of vaguely remembered this, and I looked it up just to be sure I was right. So back in 2018, if you want to look this up, I found an article in the New York Post about this. I don't know where I saw it originally. Apparently, in 2018, a red cow was born in Israel. And there are these people who really want to rebuild the temple. Right? But if you rebuild the temple, then you're going to, in order to go in there, you're going to need the ashes of this cow so you can be purified. So they saw this as a kind of sign that God was letting them know that it's time to rebuild the temple. Of course, that's an extremely bad thing, right? Because the temple is where the mosque is now, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the Dome of the Rock. And so somehow you would have to eradicate everything there, right? So, almost all Israelis, religious and non-religious, are not looking for people to at least immediately rebuild the temple, but this is an extreme group. They have been working for many years to try to recreate some of the temple vessels. You can go, they have a museum and they've created this, and if you're in Jerusalem, you can go see it. Anyway, so they got very excited. Fortunately, though unfortunately for them, the cow didn't stay red. Because it didn't stay red, it didn't fulfill the qualifications. And so sadly, they had to give up. The other thing I want to tell you about this red cow and how rare it is a wonderful story from the Talmud, which I'm going to share with you on my screen in a second. In fact, let me put it up now. So here we go. Hopefully it'll be, yes, okay, here it is. So this comes from a section of the Talmud in the tractate Kiddushin, and they're really talking about honoring parents and the degree to which you need to go to honor parents. And so, you see my pointer here, Rav Yehuda says, in the name of Shmuel, they asked Rabbi Eliezer, how far must one go to fulfill the mitzvah of honoring one's father and mother? And Rabbi Eliezer says to them, go see what one Gentile did for his father in Ashkelon. The name of the son was Dama ben Nitina. Okay, so here's the story. Once the sages wished to purchase precious stones from him for the ephod of the high priest, right? So the high priest on his garments wears the ephod, and it has precious stones, one stone representing each of the tribes of Israel. Apparently, they needed new stones. It's not really clear why, but for some reason they needed new stones, and they were willing to buy them. They needed them so badly. He would have made, Dama ben Netina would have made 600,000 gold dinars as a profit, right? An extraordinary profit to make. Apparently, they really needed the stones, and there was enough money in the temple treasury. And Rav Kahana taught that it was really 800,000 gold dinars, right? Huge amount. And this is a story, right? So we're going to embellish the story. The key to the chest holding the jewels was under his father's head. Father apparently is sleeping or napping. And he, meaning Dama, the son of Netunya, would not disturb his father. Couldn't do it, wouldn't do it. He was so honoring his father that even at this enormous loss of potential profit, he wouldn't wake him up. The next year, the Holy One, blessed be he, gave Dama ben Netunya as his reward that a red heifer was born in his herd. And the Jews needed it. And when the sages of Israel came to him, he said to them, I know concerning you that if I were to ask for all the money in the world, you would give it to me. But I only asked for the money that I lost due to the honor of father, right? So this was even more extraordinary. They could have charged anything, but all he wants to do is recoup what he would have gained. So here God is kind of rewarding him for honoring his father, right? So there's a number of remarkable things about this story. One of which is that they are learning from a non-Jew, right? You want a great example of how you could really honor your parents? There's this non-Jewish guy. See what he did, right? How far he was willing to go. And then we have, this doesn't really have to do with the red heifer, but it is a really interesting statement, so I'll go on for a minute. Rabbi Hanina says, if this is related about one who is not commanded by the Torah to honor his father, right? The Torah commandments are really there for Jews. And Rab Dama was a Gentile, and nevertheless, he performed the mitzvah and was given this great reward. All the more so is one rewarded who is commanded to fulfill a mitzvah and performs it. So this idea, which is true of any mitzvah, not just the mitzvah of honoring parents, the idea here is if you're not commanded, but you do it anyway, right? Your reward is not as great. It's not considered as praiseworthy as someone who is commanded and does it. And that seems surprising. In fact, there's another opinion, which we'll see further on. I'm not going to look at it, which says the opposite, but this is the opinion which is accepted. So you might think, hey, he didn't have to do it, right? And he did it anyway. Isn't that better than someone who's stuck doing it, right? Seems like on a higher level. But there's another aspect to it, and that is, well, there are really two aspects. One is you're obeying God, right? And because you're obeying God, and think about the red heifer, and think about this idea that it's really about showing that we accept God as our king and we follow God's commandments, that it's on something of a higher level. The other thing is that we really need people to fulfill these mitzvot, right? And by saying that you're on a higher level, think about the mitzvah, for example, of going to the minyan, right? So we want to say that if you fulfill your obligation, you're on the highest level, not just because you feel like going. Because if it was because you feel like going, then on the day you don't feel like going, you won't be there. Okay, anyway, this is a classic story, which illustrates, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. It's a classic story which really illustrates how valuable and how rare this calf is. There's a whole lot of other material there in Kiddushin 31a in the Talmud, which talks about honoring parents. And it's fantastic stuff. So if you ever get a chance, you can go online, you can look up Kiddushin 31a and read it for yourself. It's not hard. It's pretty straightforward. It's a series of stories and more than stories, also various laws distinguishing between, say, what does it mean to honor the Torah uses two different words. One is to honor your parents. One is to fear them. What does fear exactly mean? It's not what you might think. And so it's all there. It's Tractate Kiddushin, 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 and it's on 31a. Okay, so
Rabbi,
yes.
I look it up. I have the app for Safari, so it's very easy to find everything on it.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, that's where I found it too, Barbara.
Yes.
And in fact, what I shared my screen with is from Safari, where you can find lots and lots of biblical text, rabbinic texts, study sheets that people have made up. It's an amazing, amazing resource. And it's all free and it's all online. Okay, so anyway, you need the red heifer. It has to be without blemish. It can't have been worked. Give it to Eleazar the priest. It shall be taken outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence. He'll take some of its blood with his finger, and he will sprinkle the blood 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. Then he'll burn the cow, its flesh, its hide, its flesh, its blood, all burned, its dung, and he takes cedar wood, hyssop, and some kind of red stuff, not really clear, and throw them in a fire consuming the cow. Then he washes his garments, bathes his body in water, and after that he re-enters the camp, but he is impure till evening. He who performed the burning shall wash his garments in water, bathe his body in water, and be impure. So the whole process of creating this stuff, which is going to be used now to purify people of contact with the dead, every step of the way, it's making other people impure. A man who is pure shall gather the ashes of the cow, deposit them outside the camp in a pure place, to be kept for the water of lustration. This is a great word. It's the first time I've ever seen this word anywhere, but it means purification, ritual purification. It is for purification. Then he who gathers up the ash of the cow shall wash his clothes and be impure till evening. This is a permanent law for the Israelites and for the strangers who reside among you. So this is going to go on forever. The assumption is that people will need to be purified forever because the temple will be there. And whenever the temple's there, if they're going to go into the temple, they need to be purified. He who touches the corpse of any human being shall be impure for 7 days. He shall purify himself with it on the 3rd day and on the 7th day and be pure. So this is a twofold ritual, first on the 3rd day and the second time on the 7th day. And it's interesting that this idea of the 3rd day and the 7th day gets picked up by later Jewish law. And here, it's not about contact with the dead in some ritual way, but it's about mourning the dead. And how long do we mourn, and how long is this act of mourning? That is to say, Shiva, right? Shiva, 7 days, right? Here we purify. A person has to be purified on the third day and the seventh day. So here's the question. What happens if you can't sit Shiva for 7 days? Let's say you're just unable to do it. I'm not talking about a person who doesn't feel like it. I'm talking about a person who really wants to fulfill this commandment, but there'll be severe economic loss to them, right? They have a business. If missing the business for a week really will cost them their livelihood. What if they give a critical service to the community? A physician who really can't stay away from her patients for more than a short period of time. So what's the minimum Shiva? Rabbis say it's 3 days. 3 days. Why? There's a 3-day and a 7-day here. So it's all tied to this. Seems very far from it, but it's actually tied to this. And by the way, 3 days, if you think about it, is really 1 day. Why? Because we count the day of the funeral as the first day, right? So go home from the funeral, that night, the first day is over, the next day, and then the tradition is on the last day of Shiva, just to sit for a while in the morning. So it's really 1 full day after the day of the funeral itself. Be that as it may, I'm not recommending that. 7 is the right number. This is really a circumstance where you can't. And again, it's so interesting to me that this is tied to this obscure ancient ritual, which on the surface of it really has no implications for us. One other thing that comes out of it perhaps is this idea of washing your hands when you come back from the cemetery. Right? You know, you put some water outside the house and you come back and you rinse your hands, right? Because here we have a kind of purification ritual, right? So the water is what's instrumental in the purification. And so we also have this idea, we don't do this anymore. We don't have a temple. Even the priests don't do it. They avoid contact with the dead, but more than that, they don't do. Okay, so he's impure for 7 days, 3rd day and the 7th day. If he fails to purify himself this way, he's not purified. Whoever touches a corpse, the body of a person who has died and does not purify himself, defiles the tabernacle and is cut off from the people. Since the water of lustration was not dashed on him, he's impure. His impurity is there, right? So this emphasis, he's really impure, he's completely impure. This is the only thing that can cure that ritual impurity. By the way, I mean, he can't go to the temple, but he can have contact with other people, right? This is not somehow that he's unclean and you have to avoid him, right? Or that what's happened to him is somehow contagious. None of those things. It's very technical, it's very ritual, and it really pertains to maintaining the sanctity of the tabernacle, which is where God's presence will dwell, and later on of the temple. Okay, one more thing about this. I think it's interesting that the ultimate source of impurity is the dead. Because think about Egypt. This culture from which the Jewish people emerged, the Israelites emerged. It's all about death. It's all about death. All kinds of rituals to ensure that the dead, pass to the next world. They build these pyramids. Slaves spend years and years building them. It's all about death. We left that place and we view death as a source of contamination, right? Not as a central religious experience, but somehow not something that we should be involved with, except when we have to. And we're going to see here that it's not just the corpse itself. When a person dies in a tent, whoever enters the tent, whoever is in the tent shall be impure for 7 days. And this is why the Kohen doesn't go into the funeral home, because it's like a tent. And even though it's just symbolic, and even though we don't have the temple, there is this idea should maintain a certain kind of ritual purity. The funeral, any enclosed structure, every open vessel with no lid fastened down shall be impure. And in the open, anyone who touches a person who was killed or died naturally, or a human bone or a grave, shall be impure for 7 days. Right? Some of the ashes from the fire of purification will be taken to the impure person. Fresh water will be added. A person who is impure who is pure will take the hyssop, dip it in the water, sprinkle the tent and all of its vessels. Right? So it's not just, it's whoever is talking, please. Whoever is, okay. So it's not just about the person, it's anything that gets in contact with the dead. Again, pure people sprinkle on impure people the 3rd day, the 7th day, washes their clothes, right? And then skipping down, right? It's a law for all time. He who is sprinkled with the water of lustration washes clothes. Whoever touches the water will be impure. Whatever the impure person touches will be impure. The person who touches him will be impure. So somehow the process of purification, paradoxically, right, creates in someone else impurity, but it's a most lower level of impurity because they're only impure until the evening. All right, I'm going to now give you a chance. I'm coming back to the gallery view. We finished this law of the red heifer. Any questions or observations that you would like to make? Anything you want to share about it? Just take a minute. Marilyn, I'd like to ask you to unmute.
I did.
Good.
How come there is no Jewish Hebrew word for red?
I don't know. I mean, the assumption is there is in modern Hebrew, without question. Right? The assumption is scholars think that people simply didn't differentiate the color enough that they needed a word for it. So I'm trying to think of an example. There are all different kinds of shades of red, right? We don't necessarily name each one. We say it's red. Some of them are darker, some of them are lighter, some of them might be a little pinker, right? We have one word. And on the extremes of the spectrum, so we have other words. I remember, when I was a kid, you'd get Crayola crayons, right? And there are all these colors you never heard of, right? And they have names, right? All, you'd sit there with 64 or 128 crayons. The distinctions are so small, right? So we don't use those colors, or burnt sienna, right? We don't ordinarily use colors like that. We don't talk about colors like that, but we do see them in the world. They're just very fine gradations, right? So the assumption here among scholars, and they don't really know this because all we have are texts. And it's hard to say because something's missing from a text, people didn't use it. Or maybe red means red, right? But why isn't there some word for brown when we do have descriptions of things called red that we think we might well have been brown? So that's the reason. It's not that they didn't see it. They just didn't discriminate colors, as in some cases we don't discriminate colors. Okay, any other questions about that? Yeah, Myra.
Okay, I'm on mute. Red, is it because red is so unusual that why pick a red cow? Is it because And has anybody ever thought of breeding a red cow?
Yes, so a couple of things, right? So red cows are very, very rare, right? So that's part of it. Red is also the color of blood. And it is from this ritual kind of impurity, which comes from a corpse. And of course, that something had died and it had blood in it. So there are people who want to suggest a connection there. Apparently, you can't breed them because you need enough of them to breed them. And remember also that any kind of blemish, if it didn't breed absolutely pure, it wouldn't work. So there's one other explanation I failed to mention. So the word is cow, right? We often talk about a calf, even though it doesn't say cow. But there is a midrash which wants to say that this is a calf. And what it says is the mother sinned, let the child make atonement for that sin. And that really has to do with not the red calf, but the golden calf, right? The sin of the golden calf. So the rabbis in one midrash want to connect the two to explain why this animal in particular. Any other questions? Sandy, go ahead.
Yeah,
And then Saul.
Rabbi, did you say that in Hebrew, there is a word for red, but not brown? Is that what you said?
No, there's a red for both in modern Hebrew.
I mean, ancient,
In
the Bible.
biblical Hebrew, there's a word for red, but not brown.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah. Saul, did you have a question, comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the word tolat is used a lot during the Yom Kippur service, where they refer to tolat and whitish as kishelik,
Yeah,
terms of
yeah,
sins
and
and purification.
right. Tolat there is also because we have a ritual of the priest on Yom Kippur, and this tolat, just as it appears here, in another ritual, which doesn't involve a red calf at all, but it's also part of the mixture used in that ritual. Good. Yeah, Barry, go ahead.
Is there any knowledge about the actual practice of this ritual during the temple times, given the rarity of the red calf?
Right. So it seems like from the midrash I shared with you that maybe they're doing it. It's very hard to know what was done. We don't have texts that are describing, this was done at such and such a time. So it's one would assume that it may be performed simply because we know priests are going into the temple and we know these are the rules if you're a priest and the rules of impurity. It's interesting, by the way. Here's a sort of an interesting archaeological fact. So in the city of Jerusalem, they've dug up all these sites from the second temple period, right? There's a wonderful place you can go to called the Burnt House Museum. It's all underground. They excavated, it's actually under another house. They excavated it. You can see, among other things, the vessels that were used. And they were used by a family who we know were Kohanim. And the vessels they used were stone, even though there was lots and lots of pottery around, right? And you might remember that earlier we said, every open vessel with no lid fastened on it shall be impure. And the reading of this, though it doesn't say it explicitly, the assumption here, and the rabbis certainly talk about this, is a vessel is a clay pot, right? So if you're a priest and you want to avoid impurity, it would make sense to have stone rather than clay vessels. Okay, so now we get to a very, very short passage. It is chapter 20. We're going to look at birth 1. V'yavo b'nei Yisrael kol Ha'edah, the people of Israel, the entire people, come to the wilderness of Zin, and they come on the first new moon, and they stay at Kadesh. And
Getting background noise here.
yeah, we are getting background noise. And
And you, why don't you mute Hannah since she's,
I will mute Hannah if I can find her. I don't, here she is. Yeah, she's muted. Okay, thank you. It's a good suggestion. Okay, so what happens? Miriam dies. Now, sometimes it's as interesting to think about what isn't told as what is. So I want to jump ahead towards the end of the parsha. And let me see if I can find it. Yes, okay. So beginning with verse 27 of chapter 20. So God says to Aaron, strip your garments and put them on your son. And he does that, and Aaron will die. He'll be gathered up to the dead. And they go up on a mountain, and the whole community learned that Aaron had breathed his last. And the house of Israel bewailed Aaron 30 days, right? At the very end of chapter 20. So what happens when Aaron dies? Everybody mourns. The whole people mourn. What happens when Miriam dies? Back to what we were reading, page 884, verse 1, chapter 20. Miriam died and was buried. Period. End of story. Sometimes what's missing tells you something, right? So what does it tell you that when Miriam died, did you hear? Miriam died. There is a sense that Miriam is not on the level of Moses and Aaron, that Miriam is taken for granted in some ways, even though she's a prophet. Right? What happens then? The community was without water. So rabbinic tradition wants to connect these two things. And there's a midrash that says, because of Miriam's merit, right, because of her greatness, there was a well of water that followed the people of Israel through the wilderness. Miriam died, the well dried up. Right? So now they're thirsty, right? It's a very clever midrash, but I think because of the juxtaposition, and because I think that the people don't sufficiently understand or appreciate Miriam. And I think it's very profound, actually, that sometimes, I don't know if you remember the Joni Mitchell song, you don't appreciate what you've got till it's gone. They built a parking lot. I don't remember exactly what happens, right? But here, if you want to take this midrash at face value, they didn't appreciate Miriam, but Miriam was the source of life. She was the source of water, right? And only when she dies, do people appreciate what it is that they've lost. And so we move right away to this story, which I don't want to get too deeply into, but I'll just mention a couple of things, because I want to start with this next time, because this is a story where really, and it's a very difficult story. It's a story of why Moses is punished so that he can't enter the promised land. And you can see later on in the Torah that Moses is pleading to enter the land. And God says no. So why, and the sin, as we'll see, not exactly apparent. And certainly given the significance of the punishment, here's a man, and I just sort of want to tease you with this. Here's a man, didn't really want the job, spent 40 years in the wilderness, leading this people, fighting for them, vying with them, being vilified with them, leading them on this journey from Egypt to the promised land. And they finally get there, and he doesn't get to go in, right? His whole life's work, he doesn't get to go in. So one would expect an awful, awful sin that he should be punished this way. So we'll look at the sin next time and try to get a sense, really, of what it might be. I do want to say something about sort of the structure here. Oh, and I've talked about this before. You know, the rabbis the Torah is put together in a way where things don't necessarily happen. That is, the events themselves don't necessarily happen in the order in which the narrator here recalls them, right? They're arranged for purposes, and sometimes later things are told about earlier, and earlier things are told about later. And so it's always worth asking, why this order? Why are we told about the death of Miriam here? And then the fact that the community is without water. And you can see, what did we just talk about? We talked about purification from death, right? And how did you purify someone from death? You use these waters of lustration, right? The water in which these substances had been mixed. And so you can see, just on a literary level, how one thing sort of flows into another. And this event really, in some sense, belongs where it is because of its context, though it could have been told elsewhere. One other thing, and that is, when you read about Moses' sin, one thing to bear in mind is his sister just died, right? This is the juxtaposition, right? Because at least from the rabbinic point of view, she died, there's no water. And now Moses reacts to that, and as a result of his reaction, he loses it, the promised land, and in some sense he loses it, right? The enormous pressure he's under, he is a mourner, in a sense. I will say this, mourners don't always make the best decisions, right? I always tell people when they have a loss and they're sitting Shiva and then Shloshim, which is the next period of mourning, don't make any big decisions for the next month. Not a good idea. Put off what you can put off for a month, because we're not ourselves. We're really not. And so I think what we're going to look at next time also has to be understood in that context. But I will hold it off until then, because I want to look at it really at some length. So any final questions? Anything at all? Saul?
Lost my place here. Hold on a second.
Take your time.
Can you hear me?
I hear you fine.
I lost my picture, but anyway, I'm not going to be around here next week, but I wanted to mention this week because as far as Moshe and the rock, we just read in Parshat Beshalach a few weeks ago that God told him to strike the rock when the people were complaining to Lunot, and he did that. But in Chukat, of course, he did it again, but he did it without directions. So.
Yes. So yes, and we're going to talk about that next week, right? Because the stories seem to be parallel. And if I was a lawyer defending Moses, right, I I would say, well, you told him to take his staff like you did last time. And here, yeah, he was supposed to speak to it, but come on, right? So all I can say is I will talk about that next time. And the parallel is important. You know, by all means, watch the YouTube video if you can't be here next week. All right, and I'll be sending that out to you all, as well as a reminder with the link for next week's class. If there are no other questions or comments, I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
My pleasure.
Thank you.